is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
On February 2nd, 2009, a lady was walking her dog in the West Mesa, a large, elevated landmass in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Midway through her walk, she came across what appeared to be a human bone. Alarmed, the woman reported her finding to the police, who confirmed that the bone was human, and began an in-depth search of the area where the bone had been found. The searchers expected to find the rest of the body that the bone had come from, but they found much, much more than that. The investigation uncovered 11 sets of human remains buried in the area, as well as the remains of an unborn fetus. All of the victims were female. The youngest was 15 years old, and the oldest was 32. Most of the victims were Hispanic, and almost all of them were from backgrounds that would have made them vulnerable to predators, such as sex workers and drug addicts. Satellite images of the area were reviewed, allowing the police to estimate a time frame of when the bodies had been buried. Whoever this killer was, they had killed prolifically over an extended period of time. The first body had been buried in 2001, and the last one in 2005. The satellite images also gave investigators insight as to how the bones were eventually exposed to the elements. They had all been buried in the bank of an arroyo, a type of dry watercourse that fills with water during heavy rain. It was an area that was well within the city limits, but that had not been developed at the time the killings began. The series of satellite images showed soil disturbances and tire tracks appearing between 2003 and 2005, indicating that the killer was able to visit the site whenever he needed to dispose of a body without being disturbed. Then in 2006, the burial site was mapped for development of residential properties, and the arroyo was buried. Because the arroyo acted as a reservoir to store and naturally direct heavy rainflow, without it, flooding began to encroach on the nearby houses. And after enough people in the neighborhood complained about the flooding, an artificial retention pond was built in the same area where the remains had been buried. It was only through this series of coincidences that the bones were gradually exposed to the surface. One by one, the remains were matched to missing girls and women who had gone missing between 2001 and 2005. The dates that each victim vanished matched up with the satellite images showing that the final body had been buried in 2005. The youngest victim was 15-year-old Solania Edwards, who had run away from her home in Lawton, Oklahoma. Out of all the victims, she was the only girl of African-American descent, and she was also the only one who had lived in a different state. The fetus in the grave was the unborn baby of 22-year-old Michelle Valdez, who had been about 4 months pregnant when she was killed. In December 2010, 6 photos were released by the Albuquerque police, showing 7 women who investigators believed might be linked to the West Mesa murders. The next day, a 7th photo was released. This time, the woman in the photo was quickly identified by members of her family, who said that she had passed away due to an unrelated illness. 4 days after the photos were released, 2 more of the women in the photos had been identified by their loved ones, and both of them were still alive. However, the remaining women in the photos were never named. Investigators had a good reason to be concerned for the well-being of the women. In several of the photos, they seemed to be asleep or unconscious, and several of them looked similar to the 11 victims found buried in the West Mesa desert. In the early days of the investigation, the police realized they'd stumbled upon the dumping ground of a serial killer. They couldn't rule out that the killer may have worked with an accomplice, but they were certain that the same person or group of people was responsible for the murders and burials. As news of the case spread, the unidentified killer became known as the West Mesa Bone Collector. Considering that the case began with 11 unidentified sets of skeletal remains, the progress made in the investigation was initially impressive. But since the day that the last victim was identified, the case went cold. As of November 2023, no suspects have been officially named by authorities in connection with the West Mesa murders. And that, despite a $100,000 reward for information leading to the killer's arrest. The FBI received an anonymous tip that potentially linked the crimes to a suspect who lived in Central America. At several points in the investigation, the police wondered if the murders were the result of a sex trafficking ring that targeted sex workers at times when there was a large influx of people in the area, such as during the popular New Mexico State Fair. But no suspects being officially named by the authorities doesn't mean that there were no suspects at all. In fact, several people attracted the suspicion of the police since the early days of the case, and some of them have even had a connection with the victims. One of the earliest unofficial suspects was a pimp named Fred Reynolds, who allegedly kept photos of prostitutes and escorts who had gone missing. He also had connections to at least one of the women, but he was never able to be connected to the crime itself, and in early 2009, he passed away. Then, in late 2010, the police carried out an extensive search of multiple properties in Missouri, which were connected to Ron Irwin, a businessman and photographer who regularly visited the Albuquerque State Fair. Although the police removed tens of thousands of photographs from Ron's property, they later stated that they were confident that he was not involved with the West Mesa murders. Joseph Blee, a man known as the mid-school rapist, was a sex offender who targeted teenage girls in the around area of Albuquerque's McKinley Middle School. He would break into the girls' houses and sexually assault them before running away. He'd also been convicted of murdering a sex worker who was found dead on the street. After a breakthrough in an unsolved, unrelated case led to Joseph Blee being identified as the perpetrator, the police began to wonder if he could be the West Mesa Bone Collector. Close to where the bodies had been dumped, a tree tag had been recovered by the investigators, and it turned out to come from a plant nursery where Joseph had been a frequent customer. During his time behind bars, Joseph also reportedly told a fellow prisoner that the West Mesa victims were trashy, but that he had used their services anyway. Joseph was never convicted of the West Mesa murders. In June 2015, he received a 36-year sentence for the other crimes he committed. Out of all of these unofficial suspects, there is one man who many people believe to be the strongest link to the case. His name is Lorenzo Montoya. Lorenzo lived close to the West Mesa Bone Collector's dumping site. In fact, the trailer park where he lived was a little under 3 miles away from the graves. Allegedly, he visited the arroyo often enough in 2006 that there were visible trails between his trailer and the burial site, although this has never been confirmed by the police. Lorenzo also had a history of violence. His girlfriend reported that he had repeatedly threatened to murder her and then bury her remains in lime to counteract the smell of decay. On multiple occasions, he had been arrested for brutally attacking the prostitutes that he hired, and his co-workers found his conversation topics equally disturbing. Several of Lorenzo's co-workers reported that he talked to them about how he'd killed sex workers and then disposed of the remains on a spot on the West Mesa. However, Lorenzo was never investigated in connection with the murders because he was long dead himself by the time the bodies were discovered. In late 2006, he hired a teenage prostitute. He took that girl back to his trailer. He attacked her and strangled her to death. That girl's boyfriend tracked Lorenzo down and shot him to death. After that, no more bodies were dumped by the West Mesa Bone Collector. Whether the timing of Lorenzo's death was a coincidence, something eventually did stop the West Mesa Bone Collector from returning to the site where he had disposed of the bodies all those years. But the question of whether he truly stopped killing or just started burying his victims in a new location remains unanswered. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder today. Quick email question. Dear Joe, maybe you've answered this before and I could have missed it, but what made you start doing this podcast? And what made you do one where the stories are in a condensed format? I love it and have noticed a few copycats pop up since I started listening to yours. None are nearly as well told or researched as yours, though. Plus, they don't have Joe the host. Winky face. That's from Mackenzie in Wichita. And by the way, she wrote out winky face. There's no emoji there. It just says winky face. Mackenzie, I don't know that I've answered this completely before, but I will now. What made me start doing this podcast is the pandemic. Got real bored. I've done commercial voiceovers for a really long time, so I already had the equipment, the studio at home. So it was just a matter of deciding what to do the podcast about. And I didn't want to be just another white guy with a podcast because those are a dime a dozen. But what I do have an interest in is storytelling and true crime. But I also have a little bit of ADHD, which makes me lose my attention span pretty quickly. So I figured if people like me exist, they would like a show that's more condensed in nature so that you don't have to sit through an hour and a half or 2 hours of a story when you really just need the meat of it. Just get to the point. So I did some research and found that really no show like that existed, not in the way that I wanted to do it. So I started one. But it did take some encouraging from one of my closest friends. I've known a guy for a really long time. His name is Cassio. Obviously, that's not his real name, but he has a bunch of different podcasts. If you just type Cassio into whatever podcast listening app that you listen in, chances are you're going to find about 37 different podcasts that he's on. I don't know how many he's on at this point, but he does a lot of different podcasts, and he's great. And he encouraged me, yeah, you should definitely do the 10-Minute Murder, because I bounced that idea off of him. And he was like, yeah, do it. So I did it, and now here we are, however many years later. Anyway, hope that answers your question, Mackenzie in Wichita. And by the way, I didn't mention this before, but if you're new to listening to 10-Minute Murder, make sure you hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now. Connect with me on social media to see the pictures of what we talk about here on 10-Minute Murder. It's not gross stuff. It's not graphic stuff. And lastly, if you like this episode and this podcast, leave a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, any place that's possible, but also let your friends and family know about 10-Minute Murder. Thank you so much for listening.